Karen had always been a bit rebellious, always looking for ways to push the boundaries and test authority. On this particular day, she found herself in a bustling tourist area near a popular historical site. The atmosphere was lively, with tourists snapping pictures, children laughing, and families enjoying the sunny afternoon. As she strolled through the area, Karen's eyes landed on one of the most famous sights, a royal guard standing perfectly still, his uniform pristine, and his gaze fixed ahead, showing no sign of movement or emotion. The sight of the guard instantly irked Karen. She had always been one to challenge what she perceived as unnecessary authority. What's the big deal with these guards? They're just standing there like statues, she muttered to herself, her irritation rising. She noticed a few tourists walking by, giving the guard polite nods of respect. But Karen wasn't having it. She was in a defiant mood and felt the need to challenge the tradition. With a sense of mischief in her eyes, Karen decided to have a little fun. She walked closer to the guard, her steps deliberate, as if she was going to test how far she could push him. She stood just a few feet away from him, her gaze locked onto his, but the guard didn't flinch. His expression remained unchanged, his posture unwavering. At first, Karen tried calling out to him, speaking in a mocking tone. "Hey, you there. What's the matter? Can't talk?" She laughed, thinking it was all a joke. The guard didn't respond, not even a slight movement. She grew bolder, stepping closer and continuing her taunts. "You just stand there all day. Is this what you're good for?" But the guard remained completely still, his attention fixed on his post. This only fueled Karen's frustration further. It was as if he was ignoring her on purpose. That was when she decided to do something more extreme, something that would get his attention. She reached into her bag and pulled out a can of pepper spray. She had always carried it with her for self-defense. But today, it felt like the perfect tool to make a statement. "Let's see how you handle this," Karen thought, her anger clouding her judgment. Without thinking too much, she aimed the pepper spray directly at the guard and released it in a quick burst. The chemical mist sprayed into the air, and Karen watched, eager to see how he would react. But instead of the immediate chaos Karen expected, something unexpected happened. The guard didn't react at all. He simply raised his arm in a swift motion, disarming her with incredible precision. Before she even realized what was happening, he had removed the pepper spray from her hand, still standing perfectly at attention. He didn't flinch, he didn't shout, and he didn't even break his calm, stoic expression. Karen froze for a moment, stunned by how quickly he had disarmed her. The realization that her little prank had just gone terribly wrong began to sink in. It wasn't just the guard's professionalism that left her speechless. It was the sheer speed with which he had neutralized the situation. She had thought it would be harmless, just a way to prove a point. But she quickly understood that she had just made a massive mistake. The consequences were now unfolding in front of her, and she couldn't escape the feeling of dread that settled in her stomach. As Karen stood there, her mind racing, the reality of what she had done was becoming clearer. She wasn't just challenging authority anymore. She had crossed a line. The situation had gone from a silly prank to something much more serious, and she would soon find out just how serious it was. Karen stood frozen, her heart racing as the royal guard effortlessly removed the pepper spray from her hand. She hadn't expected him to react so quickly, so efficiently. For a brief moment, she considered running, but that thought vanished as soon as she saw the two security guards quickly approaching from behind the crowd. They were tall, dressed in uniforms, and their presence only made Karen realize how much trouble she was in. She could feel the heat rising in her face, a mix of embarrassment and fear. The guard, still standing perfectly still, said nothing, his gaze never leaving her for even a second. His silence was the most unnerving part of the whole situation. One of the security officers stepped forward, speaking in a calm but stern voice. "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with us." The words hit her like a ton of bricks. Karen's defiant attitude suddenly seemed so far away, and she wished she could take back every moment of it. She had thought it was just a harmless joke, a way to get a reaction out of the guard. But now it seemed like she had made a terrible mistake. The other security officer kept a careful eye on her as they escorted her toward a quieter area away from the tourists. Karen's mind was racing. What had she done? She had pepper sprayed a royal guard. It wasn't just a prank anymore. It was serious. The consequences of her actions were quickly becoming all too clear. As they reached the holding area, Karen was told to sit down on a bench. The guard stood nearby, watching her closely but not saying much. It was the silence that made Karen uneasy. She tried to justify her actions in her mind, telling herself that she didn't mean to hurt anyone, that it had been a joke that had gone wrong. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just about the guard anymore. She had broken a rule, one she didn't fully understand until now. Minutes passed, but to Karen, it felt like hours. She couldn't stop thinking about the serious implications of what she had just done. The guard hadn't been fazed by her actions, but she knew that the security staff and anyone else involved wouldn't be so forgiving. She had no idea what kind of trouble she was in, but the look on the security officers' faces told her that she wasn't about to walk away from this without consequences. At that moment, Karen realized that this wasn't just about her and the guard anymore. She had become part of something much bigger, a security protocol that protected the royal family and its members. She was now the person who had crossed a line, and she would be held accountable. Her heart sank further as the officers made a phone call. The sound of the ringing phone echoed in the small holding area, and Karen could feel the weight of her actions catching up to her. She had made a mistake, one that was going to cost her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As the phone call ended, the officer turned back to her. "You're not leaving here just yet," he said with a tone that made it clear Karen's situation was far from over. The next few hours would be the longest of her life. Karen slumped on the bench, knowing she had made a terrible decision, one that she would soon regret. What had seemed like an innocent way to get a reaction from the guard was now a problem that was much bigger than she had ever anticipated. Karen sat on the cold, hard bench, her mind racing with thoughts of what was happening around her. The minutes felt like they stretched into hours, and she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. The two security officers stood near her, silent but ever watchful. They didn't speak, and their eyes never left her for more than a moment. The tension in the room was thick, and it felt as though every second stretched into an eternity. Every time Karen tried to focus her thoughts on anything other than her mistake, her mind kept returning to the image of the guard's calm face. She had expected him to react, to show some sign of emotion. But he didn't. His training had been flawless. He had remained unmoved, still, and unshaken, even when she had crossed the line with her reckless behavior. That thought only made her more anxious. What had seemed like a harmless prank had now escalated into something that could change her life. Her thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of a phone. One of the officers stepped aside and spoke in hushed tones into the receiver. Karen couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the officer's serious expression. The conversation didn't last long, but it was enough to confirm to her that something big was happening. She was no longer just a tourist who had made a poor decision. She was now part of something far more serious. She had offended the royal guards, and her actions would likely have consequences far beyond anything she had imagined. The officer finished his call and turned to Karen, his face unreadable. "You're going to be held here for a little while longer," he said, his voice calm but firm. Karen wanted to protest, to explain that it had been a mistake, but she knew her words wouldn't change anything now. The gravity of the situation was sinking in. Her careless moment of frustration had brought her into conflict with a system far bigger than her, and there was no way to undo what had been done. Karen tried to remain composed, but she could feel the panic rising within her. What was going to happen next? Would she be arrested? Would she be fined? What would people think of her? Her mind swirled with these questions, but there was no answer. She had no idea how this would unfold, and that uncertainty made her more anxious with each passing second. It wasn't long before more officers arrived. Karen's heart skipped a beat when she saw them. They were dressed in different uniforms, more official looking, and their presence only made her realize the seriousness of the situation. One of the new officers walked over to her, his face stern but calm. "We're going to need to take a full statement from you," he said, his voice steady. "And we'll need to contact the higher authorities regarding the guard you assaulted." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Assault. The term sent a shiver down her spine. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone, but the reality was clear. She had broken a rule, and now there were consequences she would have to face. She nodded slowly, her mouth dry as she tried to gather her thoughts. As the officer began to ask her questions, Karen found herself recounting everything that had happened, from the moment she saw the guard to the moment she had sprayed him with pepper spray. She realized, as she spoke, that she had not fully understood the impact of her actions until now. She had been impulsive, thoughtless, and reckless, and now she was paying the price. Once the statement was taken, the officers exchanged a few quiet words among themselves. They moved out of the room, leaving Karen alone again with her thoughts. The silence was deafening. Karen had no idea what would happen next, but she knew it wasn't going to be something she could just walk away from. Whatever was coming, it was bigger than her, and she had no choice but to face the consequences. Karen sat alone in the small room, her mind still racing. She tried to focus on something, anything, that could take her away from the reality of the situation, but it was impossible. The gravity of her actions had finally set in. She had pepper sprayed a royal guard, and now everything had spiraled out of her control. What had started as a joke, something she thought would be harmless, was quickly becoming a nightmare. The minutes ticked by slowly, each second stretching on as she sat in silence. Her phone, now confiscated by the authorities, lay out of reach. The realization that she couldn't just pick it up to distract herself or call someone for help made her feel even more isolated. Karen's usual confidence seemed so far away now. Her mind raced as she thought about what her friends or family might think when they heard about this. She didn't want them to find out, but deep down, she knew there was no escaping the truth. She had messed up badly. Outside the small holding room, Karen could hear faint murmurs, the soft sounds of conversations she couldn't quite make out. She tried to guess what was happening, but everything was a blur. What were the authorities discussing? How serious was this going to get? She couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Then, the door to the room opened again. One of the officers returned, a stern look on his face. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment, observing her. The silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. Karen tried to meet his gaze, but it was hard. She knew she had done something wrong, and the weight of that was overwhelming. "We're going to need to speak with you again," the officer said finally, his voice calm but firm. "The situation has escalated, and we need to get the full details of what happened. The Royal Guard has filed a report, and we'll be contacting other authorities." Karen nodded, her stomach sinking. She hadn't expected things to go this far, and now it was becoming clear that the consequences were more serious than she had imagined. She had never intended to hurt anyone. She hadn't meant for this to become such a big deal. But here she was, facing something much bigger than herself. As the officer led her down a corridor, Karen's thoughts began to race even faster. She couldn't stop thinking about the Royal Guard, the way he had remained calm, the way he had disarmed her so effortlessly. She had expected a reaction, maybe some kind of shouting or confrontation, but instead, he had done nothing but stand there, cool and composed. It was as if he had been trained for moments like this, for people like her. The officer guided her into another room, this one much larger with more people in it. Karen's nerves were on edge as they directed her to sit down. She felt like she was on trial, even though no one had spoken the word arrest yet. The officers around her seemed to be taking things seriously, and the tension in the air was thick. One of the officials started speaking to her in a calm but authoritative tone, explaining that the situation wasn't just about her and the guard anymore. There were security protocols in place, and her actions had now violated not only the law, but also international standards that protected royal figures and their guards. Karen tried to explain herself, to tell them that she hadn't meant any harm, but her words felt weak in the face of everything unfolding. She realized that no amount of explaining could undo what had been done. The more she spoke, the more she understood just how badly things had escalated. What had been a careless decision was now a serious legal matter, one that would require her to face the consequences head-on. As the officers continued their questioning, Karen's heart sank further. The reality was clear. There was no going back from this. She was going to have to face the music, no matter how difficult it was. All she could do now was hope that whatever happened next would be a lesson learned, one she would never forget. Karen's mind was spinning as she sat in the sterile, quiet room. The weight of the situation pressed down on her shoulders, and she couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving too fast for her to fully comprehend. After the officers had finished their questioning, they had given her a brief moment to sit alone and think. But now, the reality of her actions was hitting her harder than ever before. What had started as an impulsive prank had turned into something much more serious, and she was starting to see just how big the consequences were going to be. The officer who had spoken to her earlier reappeared, and with him, he brought more officials, people who looked far more official and serious. Karen felt her stomach tighten at the sight of them. She knew this wasn't just going to be a simple talking to. They weren't going to let her off the hook this easily. She had broken a rule, crossed a line, and now she was going to face whatever came next. The officers began to explain the severity of the situation, and Karen's anxiety grew with each word. The royal guard she had sprayed wasn't just any ordinary soldier. He was part of a highly trained unit, tasked with protecting the royal family. She hadn't realized the full extent of what it meant to disrespect such a figure, especially when it came to security protocols. What seemed like a minor act of frustration to her was now being treated as a violation of national security. "You're facing charges now," the officer explained, his tone still calm but firm. "The Royal Guard has made a formal complaint, and given the nature of the incident, there will be further legal action." Karen's mind raced. Charges. Legal action. She hadn't imagined it would come to this. All she had done was make a poor decision in a moment of frustration, but now it felt like her entire future was on the line. What had started as a harmless joke had escalated into something she couldn't control. She tried to speak up, to explain herself, but the words felt weak and meaningless. How could she explain that she hadn't meant any harm when the consequences were already unfolding? The officers continued, explaining that because of the seriousness of the incident, her actions were not just a minor mistake. They were a violation of rules that protected public figures. And that meant she was now facing more than just a fine or a slap on the wrist. She could be fined heavily, possibly even face some form of detention. Her thoughts spiraled out of control as she thought about what that meant for her life. The idea of spending time in jail or facing a long legal battle was overwhelming. She had never imagined something like this would happen to her. The officers asked if she understood the charges, and Karen nodded slowly, the reality setting in. She had never been in trouble with the law before, and now she was caught up in something that was bigger than she could have imagined. She felt a sense of panic rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay composed. There was nothing she could do now to change what had already happened. She was at the mercy of the legal system, and she had to face whatever came next. As the officers finished explaining the process, Karen was given one last chance to speak. She took a deep breath and tried to gather her thoughts. She wanted to tell them that she was sorry, that it was all a mistake, but somehow, the words didn't come out right. She couldn't undo the damage she had caused, and she realized that no matter how sorry she felt, it wouldn't change the consequences of her actions. The officers informed her that the next steps would involve a formal hearing, where the details of the case would be presented and a decision would be made about her punishment. They told her she would need legal representation to navigate the process, but she didn't know how she was going to afford it. The weight of everything, Her mistake, the charges, the looming legal battle, was beginning to feel suffocating. As the officers left her alone again, Karen felt the full impact of what she had done. She hadn't meant for it to go this far, but now there was no turning back. All she could do was hope that somehow she would find a way to make things right, even though she knew it wouldn't be easy. Her life had changed in an instant, and it was a change she would never forget. Karen sat in the cold, quiet room, feeling as though time had slowed down around her. The weight of her situation was almost unbearable. She could barely focus on anything other than the thought of what would happen next. The officers had left, and for a moment, she was alone with her thoughts. The adrenaline that had fueled her defiant actions earlier had worn off, leaving behind nothing but the heavy realization of her mistake. She kept replaying the moment in her head. The guard standing still, the spray of pepper spray, and the seconds that had felt like hours as security had arrived. Everything felt so surreal. One moment, she had been a carefree tourist, and the next, she was facing legal charges for something that seemed so small, so trivial at the time. But as the officers had explained, what had felt like a harmless prank was now a matter of national security. Karen tried to calm herself, but her nerves were getting the best of her. The future seemed so uncertain, and the possibility of facing serious consequences loomed over her like a dark cloud. She had been told to expect a hearing, where all the details of the incident would be discussed, and a decision would be made about what would happen to her. That hearing felt so distant, so far away, and yet so incredibly important. Would they fine her? Would she be taken into custody? The idea of spending time in a cell was terrifying. She had never imagined herself in such a situation, and now it felt like she was stuck in a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. The officers had mentioned she would need legal help to navigate through this mess. Karen didn't know the first thing about lawyers, let alone how to find one. The cost of legal representation seemed like an impossible hurdle, something she couldn't possibly afford. She had never been wealthy, and the idea of paying for a lawyer, especially one who would defend her in such a serious case, was daunting. What if she couldn't find the money? What if she lost the case? The fear of losing everything was slowly eating away at her. Her thoughts were interrupted when the door to the room opened again. The officer who had spoken to her earlier walked in, his expression still unreadable. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Karen could see that he was waiting for her to speak, but she didn't know what to say. She wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but it felt like it wouldn't matter. She had crossed a line, and no amount of apologizing could undo what she had done. The officer finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "We've contacted your attorney, and they will be here soon to discuss the next steps with you." His words felt like a lifeline, but they also reminded her just how serious this was. An attorney. A real lawyer. The reality of the situation hit her again. This wasn't just a minor mistake. It was something that could have lasting consequences. Karen nodded, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. At least she would have someone to help her figure out what came next. But even with legal representation, there was no guarantee that things would go in her favor. The severity of the incident, her act of disrespecting a royal guard, someone who represented the security of the royal family, had made it clear that this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. There were protocols, laws, and rules that had been violated, and the legal system would need to address it. As the officer left the room again, Karen's mind wandered to the guard. She wondered if he had been hurt, even slightly, by the spray. She hadn't meant to harm him. She had just wanted to get a reaction. But now, all she could think about was how her actions had spiraled out of control, turning into something that was far beyond what she had ever intended. The minutes dragged on. Karen sat in silence, contemplating everything she had done, and everything that was yet to come. She had no choice now but to wait. Wait for her attorney, wait for the hearing, and wait for whatever consequences would follow. She couldn't change the past, but she could try her best to face whatever came next with the strength to make it through. Even though she didn't know how, Karen realized that she was going to have to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Karen's mind was in a constant whirl as she sat waiting for the lawyer to arrive. Every little noise in the hallway outside made her jump, and the silence in the room felt almost suffocating. She could barely focus on anything, not even the clock on the wall that seemed to tick slower with each passing second. The weight of the situation was pressing down on her harder than ever. She couldn't help but feel completely out of control, as though everything in her life was unraveling before her eyes. Her thoughts constantly drifted back to the guard, the way he had remained so calm and composed, the way he had disarmed her in a matter of seconds. She hadn't expected it to be that easy for him. She had never imagined that something so small, so fleeting, could turn into such a huge ordeal. She had been frustrated in the moment, but now, she couldn't even explain why she had done it. It had been a silly thing to do, an impulsive reaction that she deeply regretted. But the damage was done, and there was no going back. As time stretched on, the feeling of waiting became almost unbearable. She thought about the hearing and what it would entail. Would it be a courtroom? Would she be standing in front of a judge? The thought made her feel small and insignificant. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't someone who had ever done anything to deserve such attention. But here she was, caught in a mess of her own making, facing consequences she hadn't expected and couldn't easily escape. The door to the room finally opened, and Karen's heart skipped a beat. A woman in a sharp suit stepped in, her posture confident and professional. She introduced herself as the lawyer assigned to her case. Karen felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by a fresh wave of anxiety. The lawyer's presence meant that things were about to get real. This was no longer just a simple misunderstanding. It was something that required legal attention, and Karen wasn't sure what to expect. The lawyer sat across from Karen, looking over her file before speaking. "I've been briefed on the situation," she began, her voice calm and clear. "This is serious, but we will go over the details together, and I will help you through it. The most important thing is to stay calm and not to panic." Karen nodded, though she felt anything but calm. The lawyer continued, outlining what the next steps would be. She would be given the opportunity to explain herself during the hearing, and they would gather all the necessary information to present her side of the story. But even as the lawyer spoke with reassurance, Karen couldn't shake the fear building in her chest. What if it wasn't enough? What if the consequences were harsher than she had imagined? The lawyer explained that the guard, as a member of the royal security, had every right to file a report. The legal system was set up to protect people like him, and the charges could be more severe depending on how the court chose to interpret her actions. Karen didn't realize just how serious the situation was until now. She had never been in trouble with the law, and the idea of facing a courtroom, possibly with a record that would follow her for years, made her stomach turn. She didn't want to be known for this mistake forever. As the lawyer spoke about the legal process, Karen tried to focus, but her thoughts kept drifting back to what she had done. She remembered the way the officer had explained the seriousness of the charges and how she had been told she needed to respect the rules and regulations that had been in place for centuries. She had taken them lightly, and now she was paying the price. The weight of her own actions seemed heavier than ever. The lawyer looked at her with a sympathetic expression. "I know this is overwhelming," she said softly, "but we'll handle this one step at a time. We'll present your case, explain that this was a moment of poor judgment, and show that you didn't intend any harm." Karen wanted to believe her, but there was a nagging feeling deep inside that made her wonder if that would really be enough. She had acted impulsively, without thinking, and now she was left to face the consequences. The lawyer stood up, signaling that their meeting was coming to an end. "You'll need to be ready for the hearing," she said. "Stay calm, and we'll make sure you have the best chance possible." As the lawyer left the room, Karen was once again left alone with her thoughts. The path ahead still felt unclear, but she knew one thing for certain. She was going to have to face whatever happened next with as much strength as she could muster. Even though she had made a huge mistake, it wasn't the end of the world. She still had the chance to make things right, and she was determined to do whatever it took. The day of the hearing finally arrived, and Karen felt like she had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for what seemed like an eternity. The feeling of dread hadn't lifted at all. She had spent the last few days worrying, replaying every moment of the incident over and over again in her mind. Despite her lawyer's calm reassurances, she couldn't shake the fear that things wouldn't go in her favor. What if her explanation wasn't enough? What if the court saw her actions as something worse than a simple mistake? As she walked into the courtroom, Karen's hands felt clammy, her heart beating a little too fast. The room was cold and sterile, filled with people she didn't know. The judge sat at the front, looking stern and composed, while a few other officials and lawyers were seated at the side. Karen felt like an outsider, like she didn't belong in this serious environment. She had never imagined herself in a place like this, let alone as the one on trial. Her lawyer stood beside her, offering the supportive smile. "Just stay calm," she whispered, her voice soft but firm. "We've got this." Karen nodded, but her nerves didn't settle. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew this was the moment that would determine what would happen to her next. The judge called the court to order, and Karen took a deep breath as the proceedings began. The prosecutor spoke first, outlining the facts of the case. Karen had pepper-sprayed the royal guard. She had broken a rule, a protocol that was in place to ensure the safety and dignity of the royal family. The prosecutor made it clear that what she had done was a serious violation, even if it had been done impulsively. Karen's stomach twisted as she listened. She had never thought of it as a huge offense. But now, hearing it laid out in front of her, she understood just how much trouble she was really in. Then it was Karen's turn. Her lawyer stood and began to speak on her behalf, explaining that Karen had never intended to hurt anyone. She had acted out of frustration, and what had happened was a mistake, a rash decision made in a moment of poor judgment. Karen's lawyer spoke with calm authority, trying to show that Karen had learned from her actions and that she understood the gravity of the situation now. When it was finally Karen's turn to speak, she felt a lump in her throat. She had to face the truth of what she had done. She had to own up to her mistake, even though she still felt the shame of it deep in her chest. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Karen began, her voice trembling slightly. "I acted without thinking. It was stupid, and I regret it every day. I never intended to disrespect anyone, especially not the guard. I'm sorry for what I did, and I understand how serious it is now." Her words felt raw, but Karen could feel them coming from a place of honesty. She wasn't trying to make excuses. She was owning up to her actions. As she finished speaking, she glanced at the judge, hoping her sincerity would come through. But there was still the nagging doubt that it might not be enough. The court listened carefully, and there was a moment of silence after she spoke. Karen felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she had never felt before. She had spent her whole life avoiding being the center of attention, yet here she was, with all eyes on her, waiting for judgment. The judge finally spoke, his voice steady and firm. "This court understands that mistakes happen, but they come with consequences. The defendant has shown remorse, and this will be taken into consideration. However, actions like the one we've seen today cannot be overlooked." Karen's heart sank as the judge continued. She didn't know what the consequences would be, but she knew they were coming. Her mind raced as she waited for the final decision. The judge paused for a moment before looking directly at Karen. "You will be fined for your actions, and there will be a probation period during which your conduct will be monitored. Additionally, you are required to attend a series of lessons on the importance of respecting authority and understanding the role that guards and security play in society." Relief flooded through Karen as she realized the punishment wasn't as severe as she had feared. She had been prepared for worse, but in the end, the judge had been fair. The consequences were harsh enough to make her understand the seriousness of her mistake, but they weren't life-shattering. It wasn't a free pass, but it was a second chance. As Karen left the courtroom, She felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't over yet. She still had to complete the lessons and pay the fine. But she was grateful that things hadn't turned out worse. She realized she had learned a valuable lesson. She had acted impulsively and caused harm, but she now understood the importance of thinking before acting and respecting the rules that were in place. The incident had changed her, and she